I have to say thank you to Professor Davison for bringing up what we historians do. We ask questions, and we usually don't have many answers. We have interpretations, of course, and we look at old questions, and then sometimes we create new questions. And what happens is we are drawn to topics where our ignorance is usually only exceeded by our lack of knowledge. And when you take that idea and you link it with something that I became interested in several years ago, that is the cultural turn that we have been taking, and particularly in American academics, I thought about it and I said, well, what happens if you take the cultural turn and it meets the first turn? Because what happens is you have automotive history, you have sport history, and the two kind of merge, and you have this little mixture, and what you have drop out of that is this little red-headed stepchild orphan of both motorsport history. So I began really looking at that as an academic. And being an academic in America, when you're talking motoring, you mean you actually put footnotes in what you write. And one of the things that occurred to me is that even though I thought I knew a lot about racing history, my lack of knowledge, and this is really embarrassing, my area of concentration, basically late 19th century into the mid 20th century, is that the early years of American motor racing, my ignorance was about zero. Yes, there's Indianapolis, millions and millions of words. There's the Vanderbilt Cup, probably hundreds of thousands of words. And then it starts trickling down to about nothing. So I began really thinking about it. So one of the other aspects about this cultural turn, meeting the first turn, is, well, something occurred to me, particularly with this with this conference, was, wait a minute, this urban and suburban aspect of motor racing in the early years that had been there, but I hadn't really given it much thought. So this is what I'm going to try to talk about. I'm giving you a really quick, down and dirty overview of the first 25 years of American sport, which is where my attention has been drawn, again, because there is nothing there. There is nothing academically, and even the hobbyist historians have really not visited this area. They'll tell you about the cars, they'll tell you about the personalities, occasionally outside, even Indianapolis, millions. But as far as that period of racing, it's just this vast wasteland. And it's really not much different internationally when you come down to it. But this is an area, again, my ignorance and my lack of knowledge, the more I looked at it, the more amazing is how I gotten through life this far. I'll talk about the first automotive contest, then I'm going to look at some areas where racing took place. Look quick, because I don't have a lot of time. In 1895-96, you had the first three events. In 1899, you can read all this. But basically what happens, you see a development. Up until about 1908, the Automobile Club of America and the American Automobile Association have a schism in 1908. It was not caused by some hobbyist historians that suggested by racing. It had to do with dues. Always follow the money. And this is what it all came about, was because the AAA had changed its due structure, and the ACA, which had a largest club inside this organization, took exception to that. So boom, you had this big schism, which collateral damage was racing. And it was resolved. The AAA came up with a contest board. And then you began to see all what's happening here. In 1909 to about 1915, something that little problem we have in American racing is that there were no champions. In 1905, we had a national champion, Barney Ofield. But not until 1916 do we actually have a championship that's officially organized. The board tracks come in starting in 1910, but 1915 they start popping up, and I'll show you a bunch of those. And then in 1920, you have to understand, whereas racing stopped in most of the world, it continued in the United States. Something that kind of gets overlooked because all of ours is very European-centric. Okay, let's talk with the very first automotive contest in America. It's by the Chicago Times-Herald, and you can see the route on the left side of the screen. You can see the route that was published in 1895. Here's a route, 1945. Charles King had in a publication. It's from a place called Jackson Park, which is still exists. There's a plaque there in Chicago. And it went all the way up into downtown Evanston, about 25, 26 miles away, and then back. And the X you see right there is over the winner of the race, the Duray, Frank Duray. This is one of the few pictures I could find of a composite picture of the event taking place. And over here you can see one of the entries that actually showed up for the race. By the way, there were like 80 entries for this race. Only a few showed up, which is amazing because you could only count the number of cars in the United States at the time in hundreds. So you had 80 entries. This is amazing. It was the contest. What's in a race? It was a contest. Took place on a bitterly cold Thanksgiving Day. The snow was somewhere around 2 feet of snow. It took place. The temperatures were around just above zero. So it was just wonderful conditions for the race. Here are some of the cars that took place. Over here in the top left is the second place car that eventually showed up. Over here I have two pictures of the same car because it really fascinated me how you just switch it around. It's called the Electrobat. That's a Morris car. And again, because of time, I'm kind of rushing through this, I apologize. But that's the Duray who won the race. And how many of you ever realized this became an attraction in Barnum and Beatty Circus? Really amazing. And then it was a very popular topic. There's been a number of, actually several academic papers done on it. It set the tone it was very much a European type race, just like it had been done, town, city to city. Decoration Day, which is May 30th, before it became Memorial Day, had a race. If you look way down here on the left side of the picture, where New York City Hall is located, look way up here past the reservoir. It's a place called Irvington, New York. And I kept wondering why this race sponsored by Cosmopolitan magazine went from City Hall, that's City Hall, to Irvington. Then I realized, wait a minute, that's where the Cosmopolitan magazine building there was located. And he went to a country club, Ardsley Country Club, which is only about a block or two away from the Cosmopolitan building, which had been a mystery to me. Of all the places that this contest could have taken place, why did it go to that particular town? And I never found an article that ever really expressed that. So thank you very much for letting me solve that mystery. Here is something out of Scientific American, something, again, it was won by Duray. 6 entries actually showed up. The problem is they had some of the first traffic accidents recorded in the city of New York. Only one car made it back relatively unscratched. It was hours and hours between the first car and the second car, both were Duray. Some of the cars broke. One car didn't even make it back until the next day. But this was a point-to-point race. Well, that changed in September, Labor Day. The Rhode Island State Fair was at a place called Narragansett Park. And they actually said, we're going to have a race on our horse track. We're going to have 5-mile heats, but to be able to qualify for this event, you have to make a time, your minimum speed of 15 miles an hour for one lap. Now think about 15 miles an hour, you could probably run that, some of our better athletes. Back then that was a challenge. So you only had a few entries actually show up, 7 of them. It was planned to have 5 races spread over about a week. Unfortunately, not that we have that, you have that here in Melbourne, inclement weather, but inclement weather intervened so that we only had 3 out of the 5 races were run. 2 of them were won by an electric car built by A.L. Riker, who will become the American Locomotive ALCO later on, involved with that company. And the third heat was won by the car that shorted out in the Chicago race, the Morris Electrobat. So he won the third heat, but overall it went to the Riker. This set basically the template for most of American racing that's taken place since then. On some type of a closed circuit, particularly in this case an oval, although you'll find that some of these ovals are not oval at all. They're very like roundish type of things. First I want to talk about New York City area. If you look at this map on the left side, on the Hudson River, that's New Jersey. And in New Jersey, which is in the metropolitan area, probably the first recorded race I could find in the New York City area. By the way, this was the center of racing for a while in America, believe it or not. On the other side there is a place called Gutenberg, New Jersey, which had a horse track, a half-mile track. In 1900, I found the race that took place there using motor cars. And then I'll talk about something later about hill climb, Eagle Rock, I'll talk about that. But up north, towards the very top, you can see Yonkers. That's where one of the tracks we're going to talk about. But what I'm going to spend some time really looking at in a few minutes is down here towards Coney Island, Brighton Beach track. And then you'll see another one called Coney Island Jockey Club. That is a Sheepshead Bay area. Sheepshead Bay had one great favored son that probably name doesn't mean much here in Australia, but Vince Lombardi, actually the great American football coach, actually was born and raised in Sheepshead Bay and lived on the site where this former track we're going to be talking about. One of the, talked about New Jersey, Eagle Rock, the 1-mile hill climb. That's one of the, this is from basically 1901 to 1904 took place. This shows you in action. And again, you can see how wonderful the roads are. This is suburban area. It still has dirt roads. And this is William K. Vanderbilt Jr., Willie K. He competed in the 1903 race in his Mercedes. And this was real racing. This shows you some of the cars in action. I love these shots. It took me a while to find some of these. And one of the biggest problems is you'll notice over here on the left side, you can see this is at the top of the hill, and here are spectators on the hill. Crowd control in American racing. It's one of the reasons we went to horse tracks, because the road races, the crowd control was really, really a challenge. But this is a very good example. You see with a megaphone announcing to crowds that the car is getting ready to come. Brighton Beach. This particular track was opened in about 1878. It was actually not torn down to almost 1970. Even though it was a derelict for probably the last 20 or 30 years. It was built for horse racing, of course. And you'll notice it's not an oval. It's not an oval. Here's some good examples. This is the track itself. And you can see on this picture, you can see the elevated railway that leads you to the hotel, which was very popular. Remember, Coney Island is a great recreation area. In 1902, it had its first race, and these are some pictures from it. One of the great attractions was a young man named George Cannon, who had a steam car that he actually was not the chauffeur, he simply fed the boiler, even though he was listed as the driver. It lasted, the last races were about went from 1902 to about 1915. In 1910, here in the bottom, you can see George Robertson, who is one of the great American drivers of the day, and Ralph De Palma, who had a match race that attracted literally thousands and thousands of spectators and was covered extensively. Great photographs. Another New York City track is up in Yonkers. This is a driving track. There's a difference between, there was thoroughbred racing and there were trottings. And if you ever see a track called a driving park or a driving track, that's because it's used for trotting races. A lot of a driving park, for instance, that confuses a lot of the hobbyists. They don't understand the differences there. But this is a 1 mile. Today it still exists. It's a half-mile trotting track still in existence. In fact, I went there out of curiosity a couple of years ago, and most of the people running it had no idea that it was ever used for motor racing. It didn't last very long as far as racing, from about 1902, just after the Brighton race, till about 1910. This is it in its heyday. That's Barney Oldfield up here on the right. This is about 1905. You can see some of the early races in 1903. This is in 1910, one of its last events that took place at the track. Still, it's a suburban track. It is easy to get to from downtown New York City. And one of the questions that comes up is like, that people we get focused on the cars and the personalities. Well, what about the officials? One of the things that began interesting me was, well, who are the people running these events? So I wanted to throw that at you as well. I mean, it's one of those parts of the cultural aspect of this whole approach is, well, who's behind the scenes? What are these people doing? Who's the referees? Who's the scorekeepers? Who's the judges? Who's the timekeepers? Who's doing all this? I mean, there's an organization that just gets lost in the shuffle. And I think that's very important because when you go back and look at some of the records, which still, those that still exist, you'll find these people listed. But for most people, they have never been examined. That's one of the areas I'm looking into. Now, Morris Park. William Morris, this is in the Bronx. I'm sorry, I'm Bronx. It's one of the places I used to live. Never even knew about it. It was a housing area now. It was built late 1890s. The Belmont Stakes was actually run here until Jerome Belmont moved the event to the track that he built over in Jamaica area, which left Mr. Morris without a signature event. So he decided, well, I'm a member of the Automobile Club of America. Hey, let's have a race track for the club. And that's exactly what happened. And here in the spring of 1905, they're converting the racetrack for horses into an automotive racetrack by banking the turns. And here's the first event was in May 1905. The first championship race in 1905 in what was called the Motor Car Championship was run there, won by Louis Chevrolet in a Fiat. And Barney Oldfield will eventually be the champion at the end of the season. It's completely overlooked by most of the historians that this actually event We went back and actually confirmed that it happened. I love this. Webb J. and Whistling Billy, the white racer, won in the July 1905 race here. The racing continued here to about 1907, when poverty, Morris lost a lot of money because even with the motor racing, the bills kept piling up. And that urbanization aspect that we've talked about is an aspect of the automobile. Well, people wanted to live where the track was. So it's now a housing complex. It has been since about 1908, 1909. A hill climb in New York City itself. Fort George Hill is just in an upper part of Manhattan. It's in Manhattan. Most people never realized this even existed. Here is the neighborhood. It's a nice little postcard I found. The Stearns, which competed. I love the picture with the young man reclining here. And the start was right there, right down at the, in this, where the elevated railroad is. They started right down there. And this shows you as they came up the hill. And you can see, remember we talked about Whistling Billy? Well, Walter White, the white steam cars, actually won a race on the hill. You can see the Corbin. That's how it raced. It's almost street stock. We talk stock car racing. It goes back to the early days of American racing. The white is not quite stock. Gives you some idea of the scenes. I love these. Again, this is in New York City when this is actually happening. And you say, well, gee, that sure looks kind of rural. This is suburban New York City at that point. People forget how suburban even the urban areas were, which is another aspect of why this is really where the cultural turn meets the first turn. You find a lot of things going in the background. If you look in the background, you find so much. Again, the megaphone. That's part of the crew. I also said, well, how to, look at the numbering on the car. That's how a lot of times the numbers were done. It's the class C and the number. And we didn't go into all that. But I also said, well, what do drivers do when they're not driving? Well, this is how they're looking at their times at the very end. I think that gives you another aspect that gets overlooked. Well, when they're outside the car, what are they doing at these events? Now, one of my favorite people, in fact, last year, their keynote speaker at the Michael Arkensinger Symposium, her focus was on Joan Newton Cuneo, one of the great female racers of the era. Just a wonderful personality. She's about the same height as my daughter, which is basically about 5 feet. And there she is at the wheel of a Knox, which initially came out as the Giant, but after she drove it in many contests, it became the Giantess. She's entered for the Fort Hill climb, and she's a happy camper, as you can see. If you look on the right side, you see that Joan is not a happy camper, because what happened just before she was getting ready to compete, the officials of the AAA said, you can't compete. Why? Because you're a woman. Joan did not take that well, as you can see. This is actually was taken at the time. Great personality. She did race a couple more times against Barney Oldfield in New Orleans in 1910, a year later, but then they clamped down in 1910. No females. Boom. So that ended that. Brooklyn, near to my heart. I used to live in Brooklyn. Sheep's Head Bay in Brooklyn area. The Coney Island Jockey Club built the track uh, about the 1880s. And this is the track where in October 1910, Barney Oldfield and Jack Johnson, the world heavyweight champion, had a match race that got Barney Oldfield banned for life, which lasted for about 2.5 years, because he had the audacity to there's this African American personality, and the AAA did not allow African Americans to be members. And here you had Barney, who didn't care as long as the money was on the table, had this great race, and this is the track it was on, not the later track. A lot of people get confused about that. There was a lot of blind eyes by the people running the Coney Island Jockey Club. They got paid. They didn't really care who raced on it. That was probably the only motor race I know of that took place on that particular track. And you can see how urban this really is. The track that we're going to talk about here in a second, if you see how it's kind of cantered off to like the 2 o'clock, about 1:30 position. Well, the new track is going to be cantered a little bit more to the 3 o'clock. It was not built right over that site. A lot of people think it was actually used part of the site and built out on Jerome Avenue. And that originally, down here in the right corner, it was going to be a brick track. But it was made into a plank board track instead to speed up construction, because when they found out how much time it was going to take to build the brick track, suddenly doing it in a matter of months rather than almost a year took place, particularly when a lot of money was at stake. This is a wonderful panoramic view of the track once it was completed in 1915. I just love how this gives you some idea. This gives you some idea how popular motorsport really was. You had thousands upon thousands of people coming to these meetings. It opened in October 1915, but by 1919, for a lot of reasons, mostly because these plank board tracks deteriorated so fast. They were not made out of seasoned wood. Weathering, particularly in a place like New York, did not do them very well. There's the start of the first major race there, the Ascot Cup. Get another view of it, gives you some idea what the track looked like. Let's talk about Los Angeles. Los Angeles, major area. Los Angeles had become the largest city in California until 1920. Why? Because of the automobile. People began flocking there. This gives you some idea of how Los Angeles looks. We're going to talk about a couple of places, Santa Monica, Playa del Rey. Over here, you can see that little yellow square, that's Los Angeles. And you can see all the areas that were incorporated. I love this map. It should give you some idea of how California in the Los Angeles area developed. And again, down here, this little, where it says University Edition, which says Exposition, that was added in 1899. Well, that led to this. Agricultural Park was built. I found automobile racing happening there in 1900. Not much of a race, but was still a race. And that's how the agricultural park over here in the top left, how the stands looked. Over here you have bicycle racing, which is really, really big, which is what it did initially use for. You see motorcycles, that was about, this track wasn't used for many years, only for about 1900, about 1905, 1906 was racing on it. And there's one of the races that took place at the bottom, about 1905. Well, what happened to it? Well, it became an agricultural park, it became an exposition park, and then, ever heard of the LA Coliseum? There it is. That is built directly on the site of Agricultural Park. So there's a motor racing connection that most people have no idea to the LA Coliseum. And I didn't either. So, Santa Monica. Gives you an idea of the track. Santa Monica was an oceanside venue for lots of things in California. This is a really good map of the track. Dead Man's Curve, way down here on the left, very popular, named appropriately, not quite appropriately named, but close. But it's about 8.4 miles. It was used for the was used initially in 1909. The last race there was in 1919. The Vanderbilt and the Grand Prize races were there in 1914 and 1916. And this gives you some idea what the track looks like. That's Ralph De Palma in 1914 winning both the Grand Prize and the Vanderbilt. Remember Dead Man's Curve? There it is. Very tricky. That's Eddie Pulliam crashing, the wheel collapsing, turning over. Here are some good scenes. Shows you how really urban this is. And that's Dario Resta, who won the Vanderbilt and then fell out of the Grand Prize race, which would Howdy Wilcox and Billy Aiken won. And it says about the championship, and because he didn't compete at the next race at Ascot Park, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, actually became the 1916 national champion in America. Playa del Rey. Notice anything? When we talk about a circular track, it's a circular track, built in 1910. Jack Prince was the builder of it. You can see, give it an idea. This was an extension. It's a 1 mile track. This was built just as the velodromes were really beginning to take precedence in bicycle racing. So we tried one for cars. It's not the very, very first one, but it was one of the largest. It gives you some idea how steep it really is. And here is from some of the early races here. It only lasted from 1910 to 1913. In 1913, it was basically demolished. In fact, it was burned for the firefighters to have an exercise. But look down here on the right-hand corner. Notice how close the starter is to the track. He's a much braver person than I would ever be. But that gives you an idea. And this is like in an area now. Ever heard of LAX? Well, if you come into LAX, you're real close. There's a racing connection that people don't realize with that. It's just literally, if you're coming in off the Pacific, if you ever look over to the right, there's Playa del Rey.
Got one question. Notice they're all right-hand drive.
Oh, very common. Very common in the United States until about 1910, 1911, that cars were either left-hand or right-hand drive. Most racing cars were right-hand drive. In fact, it was some of the early regulation. But yeah, really, until the automotive regulations in America really began pushing about between 1910 and 1912 to left-hand drive. Most of the cars were either left or right. Right-hand cars, in fact, there are some manufacturers, they're all they built ever in their short times and were right-hand drive cars. I have pictures of relatives with right-hand cars. Good point. I love this. Corona, California. Hard to describe this. In 1896, the city was founded. From 1912 until 1916, that's what the city looks like. Grand Boulevard is literally a circle, right? And today it still exists, except for the upper part of it now. For some reason, the knuckleheads put a road right across the top of it. It doesn't. but it was literally in the town, as urban as you can probably get. And this gives you some idea. Some of the, this is from 1913. Yeah, these are all from 1913. This is like 1914. Didn't have a race in 1915, but in 1916 it did have a race. And unfortunately, Bob Berman, who was one of the great American racers, crashed and was killed. Mechanic and a policeman was killed. So much for the racing in Corona. Superb course. The drivers really liked it. And I like this. You can see the traffic jams. Nothing new. Nothing new when it comes to racing. But you can see, and at 2.79 miles, the track was actually considered small compared to most of the other tracks being used. And you can see Ofield, this is in 1914, when he, when he was at the peak of his powers. In 1903, Ascot Park was built for horse racing. But in 1910, through the temperance movement, you all heard about prohibition in America. Well, the temperance movement by 1908, 1910 was going through states, not just banning alcohol, they were banning gambling. Horse racing, of course, was on the big target. So in 1910, in both California and New York, suddenly gambling at horse tracks is outlawed. So suddenly you have all these racetracks, usually for horses, now available. So the track set fallow for a couple of years until a group decided well, let's put cars on it. So in 1915, they revised it a little bit by putting down over the dirt what they call an asphaltium surface. It was kind of it really wasn't an asphalt surface we know today, but it was very much of a solid type of an heavily oiled surface that they put down. And you can kind of get an idea from it, from the picture here on the right. And you can get a little bit better idea from these two pictures. Very popular, close to downtown. It's not the Ascot races park that you'll see later on if you look at American racing. But it was used quite up until about 1924, 23, 24, when it was closed. Again, it's now an urban area, that is, you have people living there. This is San Diego. In 1915, San Diego and San Francisco will have exhibitions, and part of the exhibitions in both will be races. Here, this is in January 1915, and this gives you a better idea how urban. Down here at the start-finish here, that's inside the city of San Diego. If you look out through those Rosecrans, that's basically still developed. Only when it goes to the Point Loma area, it comes back until it gets to where that little curve is, does it go kind of in the country. Most of this race circuit is in urban area. This is downtown. This is literally downtown San Diego in January 1915. This is when it gets out towards the Port Loma area. You notice it's not a paved, it's all dirt. And I love, this car is very important. We'll see this in a few minutes. That's a Peugeot. That's Fred McCarthy. It broke down. And Fred McCarthy is going to be the riding mechanic for Dario Resta, who's going to be in San Francisco. But it's just great. And I love this picture. Earl Cooper was one of the great American drivers of the era. And that's the Stutz. And I just love that picture. It is just such a wonderful picture of that era of American motor racing. One of my favorites, San Francisco. The Panama Pacific Exhibition. This is what it looks like, a nice aerial view of all these nations. By the way, I had to find the Australian pavilion for you. Took a little looking, took a little searching, but I found it for you. There it is. You can't get much more urban than the exhibition. There it is at the very top. That's what it all looked like, and that's the course as it ran through the area. This gives you the track. The fact is, the athletic track is still here. The athletic track is still there, as a matter of fact. It's an area called Fort Mason where it's no longer there. The Presidio was right above it. We've closed that about 20 years ago now, 25 years ago close. But the track is still there. Here is the start, and you can see where it's been boarded over. Because of inclement weather, they actually had to go in, and the dirt track had to be boarded over because it was just nothing but mud. Because the first race had to be delayed and delayed and delayed. So when they ran the grand prize race, finally, in February 27th, the weather was so bad, it took forever for the race to be run. These are mostly from the Vanderbilt, the grand prize race later on, the Vanderbilt Cup. But this gives you some idea. The areas were kind of a mixture of asphalt and cobblestones running right through the exhibition area. And this gives you some idea how bad the weather was for the grand prize race. Most of the cars failed to make it to the finish. Again, you can see this is Dario Resta, and it's mechanic Fred McCarthy in the Peugeot. Another wonderful picture giving an idea of the sense of speed from these. And in Venice, another area in California, Barney Oldfield is going to win this race, and this gives you some idea. It's downtown. It is urban. And they banked, if you go back here for a second, those corners are banked because they're planked. They increased the speed. They closed this whole track off. In fact, it's all curtained around the track. Very interesting. It's only 3 miles long, short track in those days. Barney Oldfield is going to win the race. In fact, that's Barney down here, number 1. And you can see one of the cars getting the Parson Special. Beverly Hills, a couple of views of that. This one was built in 1920, lasted in 1924, when it just decomposed, basically. Unfortunately, in Thanksgiving Day 1920, Gaston Chevrolet and Eddie O'Donnell have come together, and fatal accident. Both drivers died, and Gaston Chevrolet became the first posthumous national champion in American racing. Real quick through Chicago, this is Hawthorne Track, just south of the main city of Chicago. It's a horse track. I love, remember Carl Fisher? Ever heard of Carl Fisher? Indianapolis Speedway. There's Carl competing. And this track was used from about 1904 to about 1910. Again, it's a horse track that's been converted. Out just to the west, you have Algonquin Hill Climb. There are 2 of those. And I love these pictures because it took place downtown. It starts downtown. And again, this is real racing. Hill climb, early American hill climb racing has been completely overlooked in American racing. It's like it never existed. I love this because in about 1912 to 1914, the case cars are going to go barnstorming. They'll be all over the place. And it's a very interesting story that I had no idea existed until I stumbled over it. It's been talked about by some of the hobbyists, but it's never really been looked at. Not too far from Algonquin is the Elgin races. If you notice all the crosses, it was a very dangerous track. Very dangerous track. Went from downtown Elgin out into the country and then came back. Gives you some ideas. Again, this is real racing. Again, I love this picture. This personifies much of the racing, road racing in America at the time. This, by the way, is the last time that Eddie Rickenbacker, who had been Eddie Rickenbacker until 1916, this is in 1919, his last race was at Elgin. And Speedway Park, not too far from the track, the Hawthorne track, another plank board track, 500 miles on board tracks. Imagine that. You want to talk about urban? In Philadelphia, the last ones I'm going to talk about, they're urban. This is Point Breeze. You can see Point Breeze track towards the bottom half there. Again, it's not an oval. It opened it had been used for horse racing, or trotting racing, and then for automotive racing about 1904, 1905. They had 24-hour races there up until about 1910. And this is some of the earlier races in 1904, 1905. Lastly, Fairmount Park, Philadelphia. It took place on the roads in a park in the middle of the city of Philadelphia. From 1908 to 1911, you had the races, and it is no doubt in anyone's mind that there was up to 250,000 people at these races every year. And the only reason they were closed down is simply the fact that the expense, the insurance and so forth of doing it. There it is today. You can still go to it today. In fact, I got this from a group of bicyclists who actually go around the track a couple times a year. They actually have, they raised it, said they considered it. And this is how it looked back from 1908 to 1911. This is George Robinson up here on the right after winning in 1908. And again, this is in the middle of Philadelphia, people going very fast. And again, one of the questions that came up, well, who are these people putting on this race? The Quaker City Motor Club. I started looking into them. This is some of the officials. So a lot of questions. How did they get away with this? There's been a good book on this, but and I want to just throw that in there. Gives you a good idea of. You can just barely. That's just a touch of the crowd. And basically, that's it. So, thank you.